Good morning, everybody. It's a great pleasure to be here today with you and to open this session on a subject of paramount importance, the financial inclusion of refugees in Europe. My name is Susanne Klink, and I lead UNHCR's work on refugee integration and inclusion in Europe. To start, allow me to give you an idea of the scope and to frame the topic. By the end of 2022, Europe hosted 36% of all refugees globally, or 12.4 million refugees. Turkey is the largest host country worldwide with 3.6 million refugees, followed by Germany and Poland. In addition, there were 1.3 million asylum seekers, 500,000 stateless persons, and 7.2 million internally displaced persons across Europe, leading to a total number of 21.8 million forcibly displaced and stateless persons in the region. Primary countries of origin include Ukraine, Syria, and Afghanistan. So how are refugees and financial inclusion linked? Access to financial services is fundamental for the integration and inclusion of forcibly displaced and stateless persons. Without a bank account, access to decent work is extremely limited, as they may not receive a salary. Many landlords request a bank account to sign a rental agreement. Social protection benefits oftentimes require a bank transfer, and to successfully run and grow a business, advanced financial services, such as microcredit and loans, are often key. In a global comparison, countries in Europe provide an enabling legal framework to protect and include refugees. Nevertheless, important barriers for financial inclusion remain for forcibly displaced persons of all nationality and legal statuses. This includes legal and regulatory challenges, as well as administrative and practical barriers, and we will speak about these, as well as emerging practices and recommendations more in detail in today's session that specifically looks at balancing financial inclusion with regulations. UNHCR is playing a catalytic role, bringing together stakeholders, enhancing evidence base, raising awareness, and supporting practical solutions on the ground. To learn more about refugee financial inclusion in the region, I would like to also invite our audience to the dedicated website of our partner, the Microfinance Center, which I'm posting in the chat. But now I would like to hand over to our dear panelists, Amandine and Christoph. Thank you so much for being here today and participating in this crucial session on refugee financial inclusion. Would you like to quickly introduce yourselves to the audience?
Yes, good morning, Suzanne. Good morning, everyone. I shall start. So my name is Amandine Scherer. I am part of the EBA, so the European Banking Authority AML-CFT unit. And for those of you who may not be fully familiar with what the EBA is, we are one of the three European supervisory authorities, and we work to maintain the stability and effectiveness of the EU financial system. And the EBA has also a legal mandate to prevent the abuse of the financial system for AML, for money laundering and terrorist financing purposes. And we have a duty to lead, coordinate, and monitor the financial sector fight against money laundering and terrorist financing in the EU. Within the EBA AML-CFT unit, I am actually leading the work on de-risking, which refers to those situations where a financial institution decides to reject a customer on the basis of AML-CFT concerns. And here we are particularly looking at how financial institutions make these decisions and whether or not these decisions are actually warranted. So I am looking forward for the discussion today that will focus on aspects related to the challenges associated with the financial inclusion of refugees. So Christoph, please, your turn.
Thank you, and thank you, Suzanne. Good morning, everyone. So my name is Christoph van Eemrijk. I work at the European Migration Network, but my main employer is the Belgian Federal Migration Center, MEDIA. And MEDIA is an independent public body that analyzes migration flows, defends the rights of foreigners, and combats human smuggling and trafficking. So we promote public policies that are based on evidence and human rights. And in that context, we also wrote a specific report on the access to basic banking services for third country nationals. Thank you. I will discuss that today.
Thanks a lot, dear colleagues. Dear Amandine, the European Banking Authority plays a fundamental role when it comes to refugee financial inclusion. Could you please explain what the EBA does, regulatory challenges refugees face, and your initiatives to enhance refugees and asylum seekers' effective access to financial services?
Yes, of course. Thank you, Suzanne. So let me perhaps start by saying that actually the issue of financial inclusion of refugees is not new for us at the EBA. And already back in 2016, in the middle of the refugee crisis, we already issued a first opinion on the challenges associated with the customer due diligence when it comes to customers who are refugees. And here the intention was already to safeguard the financial inclusion of refugees, because already at the time we actually already seen that there were some challenges for financial institutions to onboard refugees, and specifically difficulties to verify the identity of asylum seeker in situations where traditional forms of ID like passport or ID cards were actually missing. So the customer due diligence challenges were actually at the time exacerbated in situations where those asylum seekers originated from countries or territories that were associated with higher money laundering and terrorist financing risk. And at the time, it was the case for Syria, for instance. So it created a whole lot of challenges for financial institutions. And this created dramatic situations in which people in great despair were actually fleeing wars and conflicts and were unable to access the financial services they needed to survive in the countries in which they had found refuge. So with this first opinion that we issued in 2016, the aim was already to try to help financial institutions to strike the right balance between providing asylum seekers with access to financial services on the one hand, and to comply with EU AML-CFT requirement on the other hand, because indeed EU AML-CFT requirements require institutions to do some ID verification. So this opinion in 2016 was followed by a second opinion that we issued this time in 2022, so more recently, where we addressed further those categories of customers associated with higher money laundering and terrorist financing risk, and that were affected by de-risking. So the second opinion was not entirely on issues related to refugees, but we continued to look at these particular issues as part of the second opinion. And actually, this second opinion on de-risking coincided with the outbreak of the war in Ukraine. And following the invasion in Ukraine, as you know, millions of people have found refuge in EU member states. And here, similarly to what we have already seen back in 2016 and during the refugee crisis, these people actually requested access to basic financial services. And we at the EBA, we started to receive evidence that some of this vulnerable group were actually experiencing difficulties to be provided such access. And this was in spite of the fact that the EU enacted the Temporary Protection Directive, the TPD, to respond to the needs of Ukrainian people forcibly displaced by the war. And this directive included specific provisions allowing for Ukrainian refugees to open bank accounts in the 27 member states, with allowance for simplified due diligence, so the know your customer processes. So for us at the EBA, to remind those points and to make the links clear to this temporary directive, we issued actually two statements, one in April and one in May 2022. However, we felt that this should be complemented actually by more detailed guidelines in order to ensure that our efforts would be further formalized and could become actually a key reference for the financial sector as a whole. And this is why we decided to work on a new set of guidelines where we actually also wanted to clarify the once and for all, the interaction between the EU AML-CFT requirement on the one hand and the right of access to bank accounts as provided by the EU Payment Account Directive. So here the aim was really to clarify the interlinkage between these two pieces of EU legislation. So at the end of March of this year, 2023, we published our new guidelines on policies and controls for the effective management of money laundering and terrorism financing risk when providing access to financial services. So this new set of guidelines, which are available on our website, not only focus on refugees and asylum seekers, but the guidelines do contain some specific provisions that are explicitly designed for customers who are asylum seekers or refugees. So in practice, let me explain very briefly how this guidance can be actually useful and help financial institutions to overcome the challenges of onboarding refugees. So as a general principle, the guidelines make clear that before taking a decision to reject a customer, financial institutions should first consider all the possible measures that could be taken to mitigate the risk associated with this customer. And this is really at the core of the AML-CFT requirement at EU level. In the guideline, we give concrete example of what can be done in this on this aspect. It could be, for instance, the postponement of customer due diligence procedure. It could be the adjustment of monitoring that financial institutions need to perform, or it could be a restriction on some services or product to mitigate the risk, but of course still remaining in line with what the Payment Account Directive provides. To overcome the challenge of ID verification, because we understood was a very key issue for financial institutions, we also provided guidance on how to handle applications from individuals who do not have traditional forms of IDs or who do not have a fixed address, because we also wanted to address the issue related to homeless. So here we provided concrete example of alternative documentation that can be used. For instance, we clearly indicate that financial institutions can use, for instance, official documentation provided by the country of refuge, or documentation provided by an official authority, such as social services, or also documentation provided by a well-established not-for-profit organization working on behalf of official authorities. And here we give the concrete example of the Red Cross, but it could be a similar organization. Of course, in the guidelines, we also take into consideration the fact that we do acknowledge that many of the challenges to onboard refugees actually occur precisely at the onboarding stage of the asylum seeker. But we do know that many of these challenges will actually become less salient when the financial institution gets a better understanding of the customer. And so what do I mean by that? Is that over time, once the refugee or the asylum seeker is onboarded by a financial institution, the financial institution can actually know better the customer and then adjust the individual risk assessment of this customer, the extent of monitoring, and also revisit, and this is a very important point, the type of products and services for which that customer is eligible. So therefore, it means in practice that once an asylum seeker has obtained its official refugee status, once he or she gets a job and starts receiving stable income and therefore start to build a credit history, the banks or financial institution in which the account was initially opened can then offer this customer microcredit, loans or mortgages, so that the individuals can actually fully participate in the society in which he has found refuge. So just to recap, I just really encourage you to have a look at these guidelines. They are really meant to support financial institutions in maintaining financial inclusion for vulnerable customers such as refugees. But I will stop there for the moment and I will give you the back to the floor. Suzanne, please.
Thanks a lot for this very comprehensive overview, dear Amandine. Christophe, taking into consideration Myria's recent study on access to banking services and financial inclusion of foreigners in Belgium, could you please describe the key barriers refugees and asylum seekers face in accessing financial services?
Yes, thank you, Suzanne. I also hear what Amandine said. I think what we describe in the report is very similar. But so in what follows, so in what I'm going to say, it's really what is in our report and some of the key findings that are, again, in line with what Amandine said. So our report zoomed in on foreign nationals' right to access banking services, and specifically on their access to a bank account or basic banking service. So basic banking service entails the right to a minimum service, so access to a current account and most essential transactions that are associated with it. So it doesn't give the right to credit, and it is not necessarily free of charge. But nowadays, a bank account, a basic banking service are a necessity, as you said in your introduction, Suzanne, in our society, because without it, you cannot receive your salary, you cannot pay your rent, you cannot get your children's allowance, or it's also very hard to start a business. But so to answer your question on the key barriers, so it is very important to understand, as also Amandine kind of touched upon, but in Belgium, for example, the access to banking services is governed by different, complex, and often conflicting legislative frameworks. So we saw that the practical implementations of these frameworks created very tangible barriers for third country nationals in general, and sometimes also for specific subgroups such as asylum seekers or refugees. So some of the biggest barriers we see in practice are like Amandine said, they are linked to the implementation of the Anti-Laundering Directive, which was implemented into Belgian legislation in 2017. So the goal for this legislation is to prevent the use of financial systems for purposes of money laundering or for to finance terrorism. It imposes a duty on banks to develop procedures, guidelines, and internal control measures to prevent money laundering. But how, according to media and also the opinion of 2016 of the EBA, like a too strict interpretation or implementation of this legislation may have as a side effect that financial currents actually go underground, which is the main reason that the legislation exists. That is why our report identified a set of unwarranted practices and at the same time also gave some concrete recommendations. So what Amandine said, this idea of the identification requirements is something that is imposed by these legislations. So banks have to make an assessment of a general assessment of, for example, the service that they provide, but also when a client comes in, they have to make an individual assessment of the client. So higher or lower identification requirements may apply depending on the risk attributed to the client and the service it is asking from the bank. So the higher the risk, the higher the burden of proof in terms of identity. But when it comes to basic banking services, and this is also in the opinion of 2000 of the EBA, the risk is generally considered low because we are talking about small amounts of money. But in practice, we saw that banks often refuse to open a normal or a basic bank account. In the case of, for example, applicants for international protection or refugees. Why? Because some banks do not consider the papers that they present as a sufficient ID or as a resident document. So in this sense, it is also very important to underline that basic banking services is different from a bank account. When a bank opens a bank account, they have, in theory, the freedom to enter into a contract with whomever they want. So they have contractual freedom. But a basic banking service is strictly regulated in Belgium and on the European level. So what does that mean? That the moment that somebody wants to open a bank account, but then the bank says, no, we don't want to open a bank account, a bank has to offer that person a basic banking service. And then on the basis of the law, the bank can refuse to open a basic banking service, but just in a number of cases. So only in exceptional circumstances defined by the law, a bank can refuse to open a basic banking service. This refusal has to be, in principle, motivated in writing, unless the refusal is linked to anti-money laundering legislation. But what do we see in the report and in general, the individual cases that we receive, is that it creates a real cascade enforcement gap. So what do I mean? First, as I said, we noticed that banks do not always fulfill their obligation when it comes to informing people about the possibility to access a basic banking service. Then, even if people know about this service, when a bank refuses to open a basic banking service, it often does not provide for the refusal in writing. And as it might relate to the anti-money laundering legislation, it is not obliged to motivate either the refusal. This then creates an enforcement gap because the institution that has to, Ombudsman in Belgium, that has to revise the appeals regarding the refusal can only take action if there is a refusal that is done in writing. So it's a cascade of barriers that it relates to poor access to information, arbitrary refusal of access to basic bank services, and a consequential lack of access to an effective remedy. So finally, and more generally, we see in our report that the amount of people with a temporary right to stay, such as asylum seekers or refugees, who can access a normal bank account actually decreases. At the same time, their reliance on a basic banking service increases. And also, we receive complaints by people from these specific subgroups with a temporary right to stay, who see at the same time their bank accounts blocked. So in practice, they do not have access neither to a bank account, sometimes neither to a basic banking service, and so they cannot work. It has a cascade of problems related to it. Thank you.
Thanks, Christoph. Amandine, while indeed many barriers remain, as Christoph just described, and you also referred to it earlier, there are also many good practices and emerging practices when it comes to strengthening effective access of refugees to financial services. Would you like to share a couple of examples that could also inspire others?
Yes, of course, because of course the landscape is not so grim. So let me give a little bit of hope. So we have indeed received the evidence of several good practices strengthening the effective access of refugees to financial services. And we have seen those practices both in the private sector, but also among the supervisors in the EU who are actually in charge of this sector. So in the private sector, for instance, we have received evidence that several banks in the EU introduce simplified procedures for the opening of basic account and also on the issuance of payment card for refugees. And we have seen also a lot of examples of banks, particularly, who have adapted their policies and procedures for those vulnerable groups. So we have a couple of good examples in this area from the private sector. At the level of EU supervisors, in the opinion on de-risking I was mentioning earlier, we have actually reviewed the initiative supervisors have taken to address unwarranted de-risking, and we had flagged these good practices as part of our report. And here I can say that many of the supervisors across the EU have actually established dedicated frameworks at national level, such as, for instance, consultative bodies, to reach out to the private sector and increase awareness on the challenges faced and the possible solution to mitigate financial exclusion of refugees and how to propose some solution. And we have received evidence that actually supervisors have used this type of work quite extensively in order to promote a more tangible dialogue between supervisors, regulators, and the private sector. We have also received evidence of some instances where supervisors have actually supported some of the private sector initiatives to tackle financial exclusion of asylum seekers. And some have, for instance, actively participated in the preparation of guidance documents intended for refugees and asylum seekers. And these guidance documents were actually issued by trade associations in the financial sector. And so the supervisors really contributed heavily in drafting this guidance document. Such guidance documents are actually meant to explain to asylum seekers the type of documentation that they will be required to provide to financial institutions to have access to financial services. And the intention in some of the examples that we have seen on the ground is that this guidance has been made available in accommodation centers and that were made also accessible in many different languages so they can be understood by all people who are staying in this accommodation center. So here, I think the fact that supervisors and trade associations co-drafted this documentation is actually a very good example of how national authorities and the private sector can actually cooperate. And it is also a sign of a clear commitment towards financial inclusion of refugees. So we have good example of what can be done to improve the situation. There is no doubt that there is more awareness today than when we started with our first opinion back in 2016. But of course, we do know that still a lot needs to be done. But the good news is that actually we have really started to see that these good practices were started to be replicated across the EU. So I think we have to stay on a positive note here.
Thanks a lot. I think that already sounds very promising that when we have multi-stakeholder partnerships, we can really advance in effective access to financial services. Christoph, from Miriam's report, how can financial inclusion of forcibly displaced people be expanded? Could you please elaborate on the role of authorities, regulatory bodies, financial service providers, and integration actors in this regard?
Yes, thank you, Suzanne. And sorry, Amandine, for giving the grim outlook. But I think with Miria, we have really tried to come up with some very concrete recommendations. And it's all to be found in our reports. But I think the basic line that we really defend is that a bank account should be accessible for the broadest possible population of third country nationals. And only if a bank cannot give access to a normal bank account because of the obligations it has to abide by, they have to give also their broadest possible access to a basic banking service for this individual. But what can we do? Depends on very different levels. So first, of course, we have to talk to our authorities. So legislation needs to be adopted to implement, for example, uniform ID requirements, as you yourself talked about. Our Belgian National Bank, for example, has developed such uniform ID requirements, but they are not implemented in the same way by the banks. We need more transparency and a clearer enforceable framework when it comes to the requirement of identity or residency in the context of access to banking services. This would create a more tangible and enforceable framework for asylum seekers and people with a temporary residence permit, such as refugees, to enforce their right to a basic or a banking service in general. Media furthermore also recommends that legislation is adopted that imposes an obligations to banks to motivate their refusal, which for reasons of anti-money laundering doesn't exist today. But when the refusal is based on a lack of sufficient or considered sufficient proof of identity or residency, and in case there is no specific link to money laundering. Then there's also a role of the banks. I think you mentioned it as well. Banks need to be more active in their provision of information in a language that individuals understand regarding the possibility to access the basic banking service. And when this legal obligation, because they have the legal obligation to give this information, when this legal obligation is not implemented in practice, these banks also need to be sanctioned. At the same time, of course, banks themselves should be sensitized on the regulation on access to banking service and should be clearly informed and trained on their duties to provide information in general on their services, but they should also be trained on their legislative obligations, such as the need to provide a written refusal, not an oral one, in the cases provided for by the law that do not relate to anti-money laundering legislation. So here we see a role for specialized integration actors and civil society organizations who would be well placed to provide such training. As a final step of the enforcement ladder that I talked about before, Media recommends that Ombudsvin, so the Belgian institution that reviews the appeals regarding refusals, lowers the bar to give more individuals a real access to an effective remedy. Where nowadays written refusal is needed to lodge an appeal, we really plead for a start of proof, as we call it in Belgium. So for example, a declaration by a social worker, which may be used to lodge an appeal to give these people a real effective remedy. Then there is the monitoring side as well. So we specifically recommend both to the government and the Belgian National Bank. So we call upon the government to conduct a thorough evaluation of the legislative frameworks that really a bit coincide and are conflicting. At the same time, we also ask them to address on the EU level the incompatibility of the legislative frameworks that relate to basic banking services. But I'm very happy to hear that the EBA is also working on that. Finally, we recommend that the Belgian National Bank monitors more effectively the proportionality of the internal procedures of banks so that specific groups such as asylum seekers, which is a group we very much see in our individuals today, are not excluded from basic banking services. But to finish, I also want to give some quick best practices because Media, in addition to the report, has, for example, also developed a platform that allows people to register their complaints regarding refusals or blocking of access to banking services. Also, FEBELFIN, the Federation for Banks in Belgium, developed a frequently asked questions section, which is very important because access to information is key. It gives banks a clear overview of what they have to do to give access to basic banking services for applicants and beneficiaries of international protection, so that banks have really a central point of information in this regard. Finally, I was also informed of a Belgian microfinance initiative, which is called MicroStart, which finances and supports people excluded from the banking system to create or develop a small independent business. I think the bottom line from our report is that we really have to focus on this issue because it's very important and it has a very big impact on people's life. And if there is a disproportional implementation or interpretation of the legislation as it is today, it actually kind of beats the purpose. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Christoph. Amandine, the new EBA guidelines address some key barriers many forcibly displaced persons face when trying to open a bank account, namely how to deal with the lack of traditional forms of identification and the proof of an address. As they require national authorities to make every effort for compliance, it is an important step towards financial inclusion. Nevertheless, taking into consideration the complexity of the topic, the role of commercial law, the challenge to balance each time more complex AML CFT regulations with the right to financial services, and the need to systematically monitor compliance, this will likely not be enough. Could you thus explain how the European Anti-Money Laundering Authority, AMLA, that will be established in 2024, can further enhance refugees' effective access to financial services?
Thank you, Suzanne. So indeed, as you said, the EBA guidelines on financial access to financial services are applicable since early October of this year. And in line with our EBA regulation, they require both financial institutions and national authorities across the EU to make every effort to comply with these guidelines. So this is what the EBA regulation provides. In practice, this means that when a national supervisor goes, for instance, on site on an inspection in a bank, it should actually check whether the bank is applying the principles set out in the EBA guidelines. So on our side, at the EBA, we will of course continue to monitor the compliance with these guidelines and to also monitor the situation in the coming months. And we are also planning, and indeed this is a point that was raised by Christoph, which is very important. We are also planning to conduct some training for supervisors in order for them to be aware of what they need to look out when they go on site and to check if the decision to reject the customers is warranted or was made on not warranted ground. Let's put it this way. But overall, we believe that with our successive EBA opinions, the statement that we issued, the new set of guidelines, we have actually already quite significantly contributed to mitigate the risk of financial exclusion of refugees, but also for other categories of customers who are heavily affected by unwarranted de-risking. And just to provide you with an example, which might also be interesting for the audience, we have also issued guidelines dedicated to the financial inclusion of not-for-profit organizations, because we have also seen that they were actually affected by unwarranted de-risking, and this has also important implication for the delivery of humanitarian aid across the world. So I think that overall, a key message we have managed to deliver is that financial institutions should not reject a customer without good reasons to do so. And across our work, we have made clear that refugees are particularly vulnerable customers, and therefore their access to at least basic financial services should be safeguarded. And this we have really kept on conveying this message consistently and across the board. A key further legislative development that you mentioned, Suzanne, is the future establishment of the new EU AML authority, so the AMLA. So as you may or not be very familiar with how the negotiation progress, but they are still ongoing. So in relation to this new authority, but it is expected that AMLA will be indeed established by the end of 2024. The package is, of course, still being negotiated, but it also includes not only the establishment of AMLA, but also an AML CFT regulation, because before we had a directive, but it was not a regulation. And actually, this AML CFT regulation will work as an EU single AML CFT rulebook. And this is very important because we are now moving towards a much more integrated system. So what does it mean concretely in relation to the issues that we have just discussed today? It means that at EU level, there will be a key new actor that will ensure further and stronger harmonization of the application of AML/CFT requirement across the EU by both financial institutions and their supervisors. So we are really moving towards a new EU AML/CFT environment that will really be a game changer when it comes to certainties and clarity on the different type of requirements. Key features of AMLA, because it's quite important to understand what this new authority will be doing. Key features include the fact that AMLA will be directly supervising a selected number of financial institutions that operate cross-border and that are posing the highest risk from an AML perspective. And on these institutions, so on the institution that AMLA will be directly supervising, AMLA will actually have the powers to adopt binding decisions and pecuniary administrative sanctions. So this is also a new power that the new authority will have. And for all the other financial institutions that will not be directly supervised by AMLA, AMLA will still have a role to play in the coordination of national supervisors and help them to increase their effectiveness in enforcing the single rulebook I had just mentioned, and doing so ensuring more homogeneous supervisory practices also across the EU. So to conclude on this aspect, I'd said that AMLA and the new AML/CFT framework will certainly bring, again, much more clarity and certainties for all stakeholders, and this is a very welcome step. And on de-risking and the safeguarding of access to financial services for the most vulnerable, AMLA will actually be able to start with the EBA work that we have started. Basically, we have started to pave the way for AMLA in this particular question. And I have no doubt that the challenge of financial inclusion of refugees will still remain a key priority of the new authority. On the EBA side, it doesn't mean that we will stop our work on de-risking, because we stand, of course, ready to work with AMLA. Also, in relation to the application of the Payment Account Directive, and from a more consumer protection angle, but this is also a key mandate that we will still have once AMLA is operational. So as you see, there are some important legislative development ahead, but that, and this is again on the good news side, is hopefully will provide more clarity and certainties for all stakeholders across the board. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. And many thanks to both of you, Amandine and Christophe, for your participation on this session and your very spot on and informative responses. Many thanks as well to the audience for listening to this session, which shows your interest and commitment to the refugee cause. Together, we can make a difference in the lives of those who have been forced to flee their homes and in their ability to contribute to the host communities through buying goods, paying taxes, creating employment, participating in social insurance schemes, and diversifying the local economy. We need to put refugee financial inclusion higher on the political agenda, continue raising awareness, and set up multi-stakeholder partnerships in order to develop sustainable solutions. The Global Refugee Forum in Geneva that will take place in December this year offers the possibility to pledge for refugee financial inclusion through the multi-stakeholder pledge on economic inclusion and social protection. I will share the link in the chat for you so that you can have a look. I would also like to quickly refer to the evaluation poll that was just shared, and we would appreciate you completing this evaluation. I wish you an excellent day ahead, and thank you so much for your participation.